Hey, it's great to be together with everyone again. We are here talking together about a text that we were diving into yesterday. We're talking about rest and how God rests here at the beginning of Genesis 2. After 6 days of marvelous creation, on the seventh day, he makes it holy and he rests. He finishes his work. And what's so fascinating about this day is that it doesn't come to an end. It doesn't have a morning and an evening, but it continues to carry on in a really strange and beautiful and inviting way. Now, throughout history, Christians and Jewish people alike have wrestled through how do we navigate this invitation to rest. And there have been two poles and two extremes that have been errors for us as followers of Jesus. Okay, so here's the first extreme, is that we make it all about a specific day and it becomes about rules. It becomes less about rest and rejuvenation. We forget about the Lord of the Sabbath and we make it about just the Sabbath as this great yoke of oppression rather than an avenue of rest. The other side is that we poo-poo the Sabbath so much that it just becomes about this relational reality that we actually work ourselves to death and we ignore that we are creatures before we are Christians and that we still need something. So it becomes just about relationship rather than living in our calendars. And in the midst of these two extremes, these two errors, there's a third way that Jesus invites us into. But before we get to that, I think an important question that everyone asks when you really start to dive into this is, okay, when I'm reading my text here in Genesis, it talks about the seventh day, which we tend to think of as Saturday. How on earth do Christians land on Sunday? And Bill, I'm curious if you help us just begin that conversation and unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it is this dramatic shift that happens where for all these millennium, the Jewish people have held this Saturday, the seventh day, as the day that they worship, that they rest, that they come together. And I should even say, even as I say they worship, it's not as though we're only worshiping on this day, this one day a week,
right,
but that we're in particular giving focused attention on that particular day, reminding ourselves of God's story, of our story, how we fit into that in an intentional way on one day out of the week, so that we can be equipped to and prepared and rested and to engage God and worship in all of life, in all of work. But how does that go from being on Saturday to Sunday? Well, the answer really lies in the resurrection of Jesus. So Jesus rises from the dead on Sunday, and then Christians who at the beginning are pretty much exclusively Jews, but as the movement begins to expand out and include Gentiles, they begin to gather on that first day of the week, on Sunday, to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And that becomes then in Christian tradition the day of worship and celebration as it's calibrated around this day of Jesus' resurrection. And some theologians even pointed out that Jesus' resurrection is almost like the eighth day, that we're beginning a new creation week, and that doesn't end. There's some theologians who would talk about this eighth day reality. And so then Christian worship has centered on Jesus as Lord of the Sabbath, but then as this day and this focal point of Christian worship in the midst of that. I think also this is a bit of an aside as we even look ahead toward Easter. We're not that far from Easter as we're shooting this video today. And the reality is that one of, I think, the greatest evidences for the resurrection of Jesus is the shift that happens from Saturday as the focal point of worship to Sunday. That only something like someone rising from the dead could cause a Jewish community who is so entrenched in Sabbath practice to shift that day of worship.
I wonder too, Bill, help us understand as we think about, okay, it's moved from Saturday to Sunday, but even this Sunday kind of took on something unique in that now there are these squabbles within the Christian community early on. Does it need to be Saturday? No, it needs to be Sunday. Or maybe could it be Monday? Do we now have the level of exclusivity that the Jewish people did as the Sabbath was Saturday? Do we still have that today where it has to be Sunday, hands down?
Yeah, and this is one of those things, in particular, when Jesus says that he's the Lord of the Sabbath, that he is what it's all about, actually becomes one of these practices that is an area of what we would call Christian freedom, of Christian conscience. And actually this issue comes up in the New Testament as you have the Jews and the Gentiles navigating what it means to be one body of Christ in churches together. And Paul actually even explicitly addresses this in a number of places, but in particular in Romans chapter 14, in a passage where Paul is talking about Christian freedom and liberty on areas of conscience. He even names this. I'll just even read this. This is Romans 14:5. Paul says, one person judges one day to be more important than another. Someone else judges every day to be the same. He says, let each one be fully convinced in his own mind. Whether whoever observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. Whoever eats, eats for the Lord, since he gives thanks to God. And Paul's point there is that not that a day of rest isn't important,
right.
but that the particular day of the week is no longer the most important thing. This is an area of Christian freedom, Christian liberty. It's not just about the Sabbath anymore under the law. Jesus fulfilled the law. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. He's the true person of rest. It's not about this Old Testament law-keeping practice of Sabbath any longer, but about knowing Him in that. I think one of the tensions, though, for us as Christians when you read a verse like this is to say, but now, okay, so Sunday's not that important, or it doesn't really matter. I take my rest on Tuesdays between 3 and 6 at happy hour, and that's where I practice rest. I think a day of rest is still really an important pattern set up for our good in the creation pattern of Genesis 1 and 2. We see this. And so I just wonder, even if, Gabe, I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the ways that you've begun to say, to guard a day for rest? What are some of the practical things that have made that possible? How have you experienced that in your own life?
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting because here's what's true. We're talking about a pastoral vocation, which has some unique nuance to it, where Sunday when we gather together, I'm working. And some of you may say, well, you only work on Sundays, so you get 6 days of rest. Not quite, right? Even I joke about this, with my wife. We have a lot of conversations around this. But I think there's an importance of worshiping together as the family of God in a weekly rhythm. But for me, when it comes to rest, rejuvenation, ceasing from work and delighting in God's good world, it takes shape on a different day of the week. So for me, that's Fridays. And we've talked about this. I pause my inbox. There's a special little plug-in for my Google, my Gmail, where I pause it, where I don't even get the emails. They go to a separate folder. So if I pull it up, they're not there. They're in a separate folder. I won't see any work-related emails. I completely unplug. And then I spend time with my family. We spend time singing songs together. We actually spend some time devotionally reading together. We'll go on a long walk, enjoy creation together. Sometimes we'll just sit in our jams most of the day. And that becomes a day not just of ceasing, but of delighting. And here's the deal. You can't just always add things in your life. It can't always be start doing. Anybody who knows anything about human nature knows you have to stop doing stuff before you can start doing other things. So ceasing of work, which has always been crucial to Sabbath, is a place to cease from doing work so that you might actually start doing something wholly different on this one day out of the week. Not to minimize or diminish what happens on the other days of the week, but it does look different, wholly other. And so that's kind of how it shapes out in my life on Fridays.
One other thing that I've realized in this, if you're going to have a day to guard for rest, in some ways you actually have to work harder on the other days. I think I had a mentor, a workplace mentor early on in my life. Some of you may know John Rich, was part of the Christ Community Story. And John said to me early on when I was in the pastoral residency, I'm never impressed by the person who gets there the first in the morning is the last to leave at night. He said, a lot tells me you don't know how to manage your work real well, and you're just letting it fill the entire day. And so being focused on really holding boundaries tightly and working effectively and working hard when you're at work, and not just allowing other kinds of things to come in and waste time while you're at work, so that then you feel, gosh, on the weekends, I got to catch up. And another piece with that too is having a kind of a shutdown routine on that day. The day before rest has been really important. Do I block out some time, a couple hours or an hour, to process through the email so that I don't have these things lingering over me as I head into that day of rest? So those things, like working really hard when you're at work, has been actually a key learning for me to make sure I have a good day of rest, as well as kind of making sure I've done a good kind of exit out of work into that day of rest, so that I feel like there aren't these loose ends that are, because you can leave the laptop at the workplace, but still take that mental load with you. And so, how do you shut down that mental load so that you can actually have a day of rest? Yeah.
And when you actually engage those things, when you begin to practice ceasing, sitting, reflecting, resting, it's in those moments where you're reminded that God is the one who's in control.
Yeah, that's right.
That He's the one who's carrying the world. It's a huge catalyst in helping attack worry and fear. Because in those moments when you're not carrying something and someone else does and has to, when you re-engage, you're reminded, at least for that one day, that week, things didn't fall utterly apart without you. And what an amazing gift that simple truth is.
Yeah. And Gabe, I think maybe we end there, and just say, I hope that this week and in future weeks that you would receive the gift of rest that God longs to give you. I think Eugene Peterson once put it that we're even commanded to rest because we wouldn't take a suggestion to rest. And so would you lean into the goodness of God's invitation to rest, and to find that in Jesus, and to find that in a day where you can be renewed and enjoy the gift that God has given you.